Hey, great to have you here. So back today with another horror movie review video. In this one, we're going to be talking about The Thing. So this is the 1980s version. It's, I guess, technically a remake, but it's not the one that came out in 2011. This is the one from the 80s that John Carpenter directed. So there's a lot of, I feel like, strong feelings about this movie. I know when it originally came out, I don't believe it performed super well when it was originally in theaters. And I think that led to it not having much success, but I feel like over time it's grown to be like a cult classic and a big iconic movie for a lot of horror folks. It's kind of sci-fi as well, similar to some other movies I've talked about, but obviously we're gonna be covering it as a horror movie today. And I'm gonna run through the plot a little bit, some pros and cons, and give my overall score at the end. As far as how it starts, you're in the Antarctic. You see this helicopter flying around and this dog running around as well. And there's two people in the helicopter. One of them is trying to shoot at the dog and just doing a horrible job at shooting it and missing a whole lot. Eventually the dog travels to this base camp, which we realize is the American camp. Helicopter winds up landing and the two people get out. And one of the parts I probably would say, what was happening here? You get the one guy, he's like grabbing a grenade or some kind of explosive. He pulls the pin out. He like throws it backwards. I couldn't tell upon watching it if this was something that like he was doing intentionally or if it was just like, oh, he dropped it. I think it was supposed to be like he didn't mean to do it, but he like throws it backwards and goes to try to find it and looks in the snow and it blows up, kills him, blows up the helicopter too. You have the other guy who survived. He has a gun in his hand. He's going to the base. He's yelling a bunch of stuff. These people are Norwegian, so they are not able to speak the language of the American base. So he's yelling a whole lot of things and he's firing his gun a whole lot and he shoots at the Americans essentially. And they ultimately fire back and they kill the guy. From there, you're kind of left with, oh, this dog is now in their camp and we don't know why the Norwegian team attacked and what all that was about. We get a little bit of character development here. I feel like they could do a little bit more in this movie, but I realized it would be an insanely long runtime if they did. But they, as I said, bring that dog in and then they go check out what's up with the Norwegian camp. So you have a few people go. McCready, who's kind of the lead here, who is Kurt Russell. He's kind of your main actor, I would say, for this movie. We also have Keith David, who's a relatively famous actor as well, but McCready is kind of the lead man here. We get a little, I feel like, character development with him, at least, where he's like playing chess on the computer and loses and then just like pours his drink into the computer and kills it. So you get a little bit of understanding of how he operates as far as if he's going to lose, he's not going to lose. He's going to say, we're both going out if that's going to happen. So a little bit of a development there with understanding about who he is as a whole. So they go to the Norwegian base camp. They can't find anybody really there. They see some dead body of some person, creature, weird thing. They also see some like ice that's been melted out and they're trying to understand what happened here. They bring that creature back to their base camp and do some studying as far as what's in here. It all looks like relatively normal things you would see. Good practical effects, I think, looking through the body. And then eventually we get to the point where the dog is bothering somebody. And he's like, hey, go put that dog with the other dogs. So he puts the dog with the other ones in the pack, not realizing the other dogs are real dogs. And this one is this alien who is now infiltrating the camp. And then we get the alien dog kind of grow out to this big thing and starts attacking and infecting and eating the other dogs. They wind up finding out what it is and they get the flamethrower. That's kind of the weapon of choice against this monster to this point because it's what they know ultimately kills it. So they flamethrower the big creature and they're trying to figure out what is this thing because they thought it was a dog. Obviously, it's got some strange things going on here and they look into the insides of that as well and they just look like normal people parts. So they're not really sure what's happening. We get a few more scuffles as far as some of the characters themselves wind up acting strange and they're trying to figure out, are they being attacked by this like parasite alien and they're not sure who they can trust. So it's a lot of turns into I don't trust you, kind of a somewhat are you good, are you bad? As a viewer, we're never really informed of who's good and who's bad. So we're watching along with pretty much the actual cast. So it's kind of fun as far as figuring out what's going on. And sometimes you don't actually fully figure it out. You can make your own assumptions, but it's never really laid out plain dry like this is the path of how it got everybody. You have them kind of turning on each other and like isolating one person and they're just all attacking each other and not really feel like they can trust each other. They go out a few times. At one point they think McCready could be the one who's doing this because they find his like coat, I think at one point. And he goes like full mode that he was doing when he was in the chess where he has like this dynamite and he's like, you guys better not mess with me. I will blow us all up. So he comes back in, they wind up having more of a scuffle. There's one guy who has like a heart attack and dies, and then they're like resuscitate him almost. His body like opens up and caves in, and it turns into like this teeth mouth thing and just bites off the arms of the guy who's doing it to him. Kind of cool practical effect there. The guy loses his arms, the monster like gets up and starts like attacking. They try to flamethrower him. His head like separates entirely and turns into this little crawling creature, which is kind of a cool effect. And they're just like, are you serious? This is for real? They come up with this plan of, hey, I think if we test out the blood and apply, I think, heat to it, we'll see how the blood reacts and we'll know who is safe and who is not trustworthy here. They do that, wind up finding one guy who's not trustworthy. He like freaks out on them and bites off the head of another guy. If I'm gonna give some criticism, I don't know why the one guy who got his head attacked didn't just immediately fire his flamethrower, because there was a point in time where he pauses when he sees this monster and that winds up getting him killed. But overall, I feel like the characters aren't too your typical horror, like stupid behaviors they make. They're pretty smart overall, but he gets taken out there. And then our characters are kind of dwindling at this point, and they're trying to figure out who's responsible, who's not. They go out to get the guy who's out in the shed area where they've like isolated him because they thought he was up to no good. They see he's been like digging down and has this like spaceship he's creating from parts of the helicopter. And the characters get a little separated around here. That's probably one criticism I would make with the film, is that a resolution that you could have if you're trying to ultimately say nobody here is infected. You could have everybody just stick together after doing the blood thing and then just stay together from then on. I know things happen, like they get separated from like explosions and like one of the aliens attacking and things like that. But either way, we get to the end point where we have MacReady. He gets like separated. He winds up throwing his dynamite, I think it is, and blows up one of the monsters he's fighting. Then he gets stuck with Keith David at the end. So those two characters, I think his name is Childs in the movie. One part that's a little hard is just knowing everybody's specific name other than MacReady. He's kind of the main lead, it's obvious, but everyone else's name's a little bit hard to fully make sure you're in the loop on. So then you have them kind of staying with each other and laying there, and neither of them really knows if the other one is infected by the thing. So they're laying there and they're kind of like, what are we going to do about this? And they kind of had the mentality before where they're not going to let this thing escape no matter what. So if they have to die, they have to die. At least that was MacReady's philosophy, similar to the chess thing, where that's just kind of his character, his persona. He behaves in a way that he's not going to lose. If he loses, you lose too. So it's kind of a cool scene where they're just together at the end and they don't know if the other one's affected or not. We as the viewer don't know either necessarily. And they just kind of like, all right, we'll just wait this out with each other. And they're just like having a drink or whatever and just chilling. And then the movie ultimately ends. So you're left at the end not knowing, are one of them infected? Are none of them infected? Kind of does an Inception type ending where it leaves you to make your own interpretation of what your truth is as far as how it ended. So kind of cool concept there. I think that's probably what a lot of people didn't like when it originally came out. They were like, give us a satisfying ending. We don't want this like open-ended, who knows what happened. But I think as time has gone on, people have come to appreciate that. If I'm listing some pros and cons for the film, I'll say as far as pros go, practical effects. This is probably the gold standard for practical effects when it comes to horror movies. I think this is one that's frequently brought up as far as, hey, don't do CGI, do something like The Thing, where it's really satisfying gore scenes or just scenes where there's a lot of chaos ensuing, where there's a practical effects taking place. And some of it's a little silly, but that's, you know, if it's an alien attacking, you don't know what it's going to behave like. So really good practical effects. If I was going to say there's one strength to this movie, it's absolutely that. Next up, there's mostly logical character choices here. So you get them running around and, as I said, separating and maybe being a little bit timid in some decisions. But for the most part, nobody's doing something that you see in a lot of horror movies where they're just like making the dumbest choice and just going into the monster and just sacrificing themselves or things like that. They're pretty logical in the decisions they make. They're just faced with a opponent who's just that much smarter, that much more tactile and getting to infiltrate the base as a whole. And then I think Kurt Russell does a great job as the lead, as MacReady. He's a cool lead to follow. It's somebody that you want to see succeed ultimately. And I think the ending is effective. As I said, some people may be disappointed by the lack of explanation that we get, but I think it does a good job as far as coming to an ending and letting you make your own choice and just ultimately leaving it up to the viewer as far as what happens or who's infected and who's not. When it comes to cons, I'll list a few here. I think the movie overall can be slower paced. I know movies that take place a little bit more in the past, like in the 80s, I feel like that was probably more common back then. So it may just be something of the times where more modern movies are just explosions in your face and you're just a lot more attention being grabbed. So it's a little slower paced of a film. In modern days, that could be tougher to get through ultimately. I think some of the characters also are tough to differentiate amongst one another, especially their names. Like, other than McCready and, as I said, Childs at the end, I can name a bunch of names, but I couldn't necessarily guarantee that this is the person who I assigned to that name. That may just come with more rewatches, but I don't think you should have to watch a movie a bunch of times to get to know the names and the characters really well. But that's just my viewpoint on it. I felt like it was just a lot of the characters were similar. We didn't get much background on them. Like, this guy's maybe the pilot, this guy's maybe like the doctor, but I couldn't tell you whose name it was. Upon a lot of rewatches, that probably could make that more obvious. This is a movie I've watched bits of long ago, and I rewatched it a year or two ago, and then just rewatched it now for this review. I think if it was something I was more familiar with, I would do a better job at necessarily having all of the details of the characters nailed down. But I think on one watch, it's tough to do that, I would say. And then the music, I'm a little bit hit or miss on. I think it does a really good job at building tension in the scene because it's pretty basic as far as the sounds it makes. We're kind of just getting like a pulsing and like an eerie noise here and there. I feel like it drags on a little bit too much in some scenes. Like there's a scene I'm thinking of when they're looking at the frozen ice section when they're at the Norwegian camp, and there's that eerie noise, and it feels like it drags on a little too long, and that may lead to the slower pace feeling slow because it's trying to build tension, suspense, which works, but maybe cut it a little shorter in my opinion. So that's overall my thoughts and pros and cons. I think it's an overall relatively solid film. I know, as I mentioned, this is a big favorite of a lot of people. I'm mindful of that as far as giving a score of this, but I want to be subjective to myself and not just say, hey, this, because a lot of people like this, I'm going to like it. I will say the practical effects are really strong, and that's probably what carries my score that I would give in this one. The story is relatively strong too, but I think if I'm naming like my favorite horror movie, I'm never going to say The Thing, but I do respect kind of its place in horror and the benefits it provided, even if they weren't, immediately rewarded when it came out. So I'm going to give this one for now. As I mentioned before, I feel like allowing yourself subject to change over time, depending on how you feel about a certain movie, I accept. Like, if you watch something upon first release and then a year later you watch it again, I think you should be able to change your opinion. For now, I'm going to give The Thing a score of 7 out of 10. So, decently above average film. As mentioned previously, 5 is average for me, so 7, this puts it pretty well above average. And it's one that I think is worth watching, especially if you're a big horror fan. It has a lot of iconic stuff that's included here with the practical effects and just the ambiance and the scenery that it puts you in this movie. And obviously, it somewhat led to a franchise where we had the 2011 one come out. Overall, I think it does a lot of things well. It really nails some of the core characters, but some of the other characters I feel like we don't get much depth to. So those are my thoughts overall. What are your thoughts on The Thing? What are your thoughts on the movie that came before The Thing? I think it's based off a 1951 or something film that came out. It was like The Thing from Another World or something. So technically this is a remake. And then we also had the 2011 one. And I think there's been other stuff that's expanded off of The Thing as well from the 1982 version. A lot that's expanded from this franchise. I think the John Carpenter film specifically led to a lot of that. So definitely give it a lot of kudos to it. What are your thoughts? Is this a movie you really enjoy? Do you like the franchise as a whole? Do you want to see more stuff from The Thing? It's been a while since we've gotten something from it, so could be curious to revisit it, or do you want to just leave it alone and don't mess with it? I love your feedback down below. Appreciate you guys so much for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.